budget. Today we are presenting the preliminary budget of the $68.7 billion for the next fiscal year, which will begin on July 1st, as well as our financial plan for fiscal years 2012, which has 6 months left to go, through 2016. We do a 5-year budget as required by law. And let me just caution everybody that the further out it is, the less reliability the numbers have. But we've tried to make estimates based on independent sources and history and to make it as accurate as possible. And if you go back and look, I think it's fair to say generally our estimates in the past 10 years have been reasonably accurate in terms of what eventually occurred. Over the past several years, as you know, cities across the country have struggled to keep their heads above water. Some have laid off teachers, police officers, and firefighters, and even a few have had to declare bankruptcy. We have avoided those painful steps, I'm happy to say, but it is because we spent years planning ahead, making government more efficient and saving for a rainy day. A lot of people said, oh, don't save for a rainy day, we'll deal with it when it comes, but that's not exactly an intelligent way to run an organization the size of New York City. We have to prepare for all reasonable eventualities and have plans in case things that we didn't count on occur. The budget we're presenting today is, as required by law, a balanced budget. I'm happy to say it has no tax increases, no layoffs of teachers or uniform workers, and no walking away from our long-term investments. When I say no tax increases, some things just go up automatically. As you know, the property tax is a tax that is based on assessed values, but there are laws that prohibit it from going up more than X percent each year and Y percent every 5 years. So some people's tax bills may be higher, but we certainly have no plans to, nor is it needed, to change the tax rates. Let me repeat, no tax increases, no layoffs of teachers or uniform workers, and no walking away from our long-term investments. I keep saying when times are tough, that is the time when you have to make those investments, and we are doing that. It is, I think, people will view as a responsible budget that continues to make responsible spending cuts while protecting the core services and investments that have helped make our city the place to be, helped us to weather the national recession better than most other places. And I think it's fair to say it is a budget that continues to plan for the future. The biggest issue facing our ability to balance budgets in the future is the enormous growth in pension costs. Right now, our pension system is fairly described, I think, as a ticking time bomb, and we are working in partnership with Governor Cuomo to defuse that time bomb. And I think Governor Cuomo deserves real credit for making it a top priority this year, because we just don't have much time left to fix the problem. Our pension costs are now 6 times larger than they were 10 years ago. Imagine what would happen to your family budget or rent, or family budget if the rent went up 6 times over the course of a decade, or your grocery bill, or the cost of a Metro card. If all prices tracked pension costs, we've done the math, a slice of pizza that cost $2 in 2002 would cost $12 today. And a single ride on the subway, which cost $1.50 back in 2002, would cost $9 today. $9 a ride for exactly the same service. I think it's fair to say that New Yorkers can't afford that, wouldn't stand for it, and yet we have the same thing happening with our pension system. We just cannot afford to pay such costs for future city workers. We have an obligation to pay for those who are with us now, and I've always believed we should honor that obligation. But we just cannot afford to continue to grant to new people those size benefits. Today's pension costs make up 16% of the portion of the budget funded by city tax dollars. That is 1 out of every $6 paid by our city taxpayers. In fact, in the current fiscal year, we expect to cross a barrier that ought to really set off alarm bells for our taxpayers. The total cost of pensions and fringe benefits for all city uniformed workers is expected for the first time ever to be greater than the total wages that they earn. Just think about that. That's simply not a sustainable course, And that is why last week in Albany I testified in support of Governor Cuomo's proposal to create a new pension tier with more responsible provisions for future city workers. We will honor our obligation to current employees. They deserve a secure retirement based on the benefits that they've been promised. But for future workers, we just have to provide retirements that are secure and affordable. And that is the only way we'll be able to pay for top quality public schools, fire and police protection, and other services New Yorkers need, and also to protect the very financial security of the pension system city workers rely on going forward. And this year is our best hope, I think, to accomplish those goals. Now, the uncertainty of the future economic outlook has led the city's independent actuary to revise downward the expected rate of return for the city's pension funds from 8% to 7%. It is the right thing to do, and other cities and states have taken similar steps. The actuary's revised assumptions are exactly what we expected, and it means the city must increase its payments to the pension system, which we had planned for. We are following the independent actuary's guidance because it's the responsible thing to do, and it will allow us to balance our budget without raising taxes or laying off teachers or uniform workers or walking away from our long-term investments. Let me remind you that in the last 10 years, the S&P 500 is unchanged. So if you were counting on investments in U.S. stocks to carry this pension system, we would have earned nothing. Not 7% or 8%, but 0. And today, long-term government interest rates are about 3%. So you can't count on investments in bonds either to carry you forward. Now, planning for the future is exactly why New York City has been able to ride out the last national recession, as well as all the ups and downs of the recovery that recession has brought us as successfully as we have. In 2007, if you remember, before the recession started and well before most other state or local governments took any similar precautions, we began ordering city agencies to tighten their belts. And over the past 5 years, agencies have taken 11 rounds of action that have produced annual savings of more than $6 billion for the next fiscal year and going forward as well. As a result, compared to 2002, in fiscal year 2013, we will have reduced the size of the city's workforce by roughly 20,000 people, a nearly 7% reduction. And in the coming fiscal year, we expect that city-funded expenses that are under our control will be $437 million less than they are in the budget for the current fiscal year. When it comes to controllable agency expenditures, we will spend less in virtually every major area except education, and will continue to invest in our schools to ensure that the strong progress that our children are making continues. Our steady, continued fiscal discipline, which involves asking all agencies to do more with less, I think is one of the keys to our ability to balance next year's budget. At the same time, we're continuing to make investments that will produce economic growth and new jobs. And that includes $100 million in capital dollars in this fiscal plan for infrastructure to support the major new applied science campus to be built on Roosevelt Island. And we're confident that this project will create tens of thousands of jobs over the next 30 years and is one of the smartest investments that we can make in our future. So we're doing everything we can and should do, I think, to keep the city's fiscal house in order and to fuel our economy. But as we continue to climb out of the last deep national recession, I think we all know there is much more hard work ahead. At this point, there is a gap of more than $3 billion between expenses and expected revenues in fiscal year 2014, which begins some 14 months from today. So although we believe that our economy will continue to grow and the tax revenues will increase slightly over our original forecast, and though we're also going to benefit from lower than anticipated spending in some categories, such as interest on our debt, the uncertainty of the economy demands our vigilance, and we'll continue to balance the budget based on 3 guiding ideas. First, we will continue to budget conservatively when it comes to forecasting revenues. Others may budget on a best-case scenario, but that is taking a very big risk, and we would rather end up with savings in the current year that we can apply to closing next year's budget deficit rather than deficits we can't afford to close without painful layoffs or tax increases. And people keep saying, oh, you always say that there's a deficit and then you balance the budget. Well, yes, we are required by law to balance the budget, so we will always have a balanced budget. But what we've done is we've put away about $6 billion in the good years, and this year we are using up the last of that $6 billion. And we do not have a carry projected into 2014, nor do we have a reserve that we could apply if we wanted to. So this year we'll get through. Next year is a little more worrisome. Not that it's going to be that much worse, but we don't have that security of having some money in the bank that if we wanted to or needed to apply to that, we could do it. Second, we're also continuing to look for ways to find savings to make government more efficient and productive. We're not going to stop in that. I know it's not sexy, but those are the things that long-term will make this city viable. And third, we remain ready to take the steps necessary to keep the budget balanced, including, if required, directing city agencies to take further gap-closing actions in the month ahead. If you remember, we have currently a new PEG put in place 6 months ago starting now. For the last half of 2012, we're saving a little less than $500 million, and for 2013, it reduces our expenses by $1 billion, and that's why we were able to balance this budget. These three principal reasons have allowed us to balance the budget with, as I said, no tax increases, no layoffs of teachers or uniform workers, and no walking away from our long-term commitments. And those three principles will continue to guide us as we work with Speaker Quinn and the City Council to enact a balanced budget in the months ahead. So now, let me show you some slides which I think will illustrate exactly what we're talking about here. This is just an overview, and you can look at it in the budget book at your leisure. But we do talk about what we have to do. We talk about the impact of overseas, which certainly does have a big impact on New York City. That's where we sell a lot of goods and services, and there are a lot of foreign companies that are here, and if they're not doing well or our companies aren't doing well overseas, then we don't get the tax revenues we want. There are some bright spots in the economy we'll talk about, but make no mistake about it, we still have the potential for problems, and we know we have a problem for 2014, and we will address those as we go forward here. The size of the budget, for those that care, and the numbers really are staggering when you think about it, but we have a very big, very complex city, and we have a lot of services that the public wants and deserves, and they all cost money. Our total budget for this year is going to be $70.3 billion, an increase of 1.1 or $1.6 billion. That's an all-funds budget. In city funding, we've gone from 50.7 to 49.1, 1.6 billion more, or 3.2% over the city-funded budget that was before. Sometimes we get money from the federal government and from the state governments, and sometimes we don't. And yet we still need these services, and so the city taxpayers are having to reach into their pockets a little more to pay for those services. And I'll show you that's particularly true in education, where the state used to split the cost of education with us and now really only picks up 1/3 of the cost. Our controllable agency expenses are forecast to decline, as I pointed out, by $437 million. That's a 1.9% reduction in controllable expenses from 2012 to 2013. And unfortunately, our non-controllable expenses are going to increase by $2 billion, or 7.5%. And that's why the total budget is going up 1.6 or 3.2 in city dollars. Non-controllable, some of it is things that the marketplace forces on us. Some are things that we have incurred obligations. Debt service, for example, is in that, and you can argue long-term we can control that to some extent. Some of it is in a lot of mandates that the state and federal government impose on us and don't fund. As I pointed out before, our head count has gone from 311,804 to 291,326. A decrease of 20.5 thousand jobs, or 6.6%. That's because of these pegs. Our city-funded headcount is virtually the same. Keep in mind, the real big difference is in education, where we still get federal and state monies that are material, or in social services, where the federal or state governments help us. And so the difference between what happens with just city funds or what happens with all funds can be meaningful. I pointed out we still have deficits going forward. We have these agency programs, the PEGs as we call them, programs to eliminate the gap, saving us $470 in this next 6 months and $1 billion in 2013. Our revenue forecasts are up slightly, not a big deal. 111 million in 2012 and 278 in 13. You'll see that projected on out. You say, well, $111 million is a lot of money. It is, but in the context that city taxpayers pay and businesses pay roughly $50 billion a year, it is relatively small, and it's slightly better, but it's certainly not an indication that things are going to do nothing but go up going forward. It's going in I suppose it's better in that direction than the other direction, but it is basically our conservative estimates for revenues are really on track to continue. Pension methods we're going to talk about when we get there. Debt service slightly lower because of lower interest rates. And then there are some technical things, reserves that we don't have to use, but every year we take a look at them. They're in, and if we don't need them, we take them out of the budget. So let me just go through some charts to show you what's going on in the city, and then we'll look at the tables to see where we're spending our money. GDP went way down back at the end of '08. This is the big crash. It's back here. It's been going up a little bit. Forecast is for slow growth. The economists argue between 2% and 3%. But to say we're going to get back to the kind of growth we had before this is it's a long time down the road. And the reason is, you can see the consumer, real consumption spending is flat or down slightly. What's been driving the slight increase is business investment, and that's building up inventories or building buildings. So people are getting ready for a better economy, but the better economy, you can argue, is not quite here yet. And let's hope it comes. It's always a risk. This is employment at a federal level. You can see slow growth projected into the future. New York City has done better than the federal government or national. We've recovered 65% of the jobs that we lost. The federal government's recovered only 36%. Those numbers are not a solace to anybody who's still unemployed and can't find a job. So we're going in the right direction, but we still have a long ways to go. We need not only to get back to where we were, we need growth because our population is growing. Private employment is really where the recovery is going to be in this city. We expect the recovery of all the jobs lost between '08 back by the end of 2013. Wages slightly going up at the same time. One of the things that is helping us is our low interest rates. You can see this line, just to put it in perspective, this is Greece. This is Portugal, which if you read today's papers will probably follow Greece. The United States is virtually identical to Germany's all the way down the lines, really go consistently together. Our interest rates are very low. That's good if you're borrowing. It's not good if you're an individual trying to invest in the debt market and earn retirement. If you're counting on it for your retirement, it's a very big problem in this country. We like low interest rates because it helps business and jobs, but if you're a retiree, it's not necessarily good. The S&P I talked about, for 10 years it is unchanged. This just shows 2 of them, and it's virtually unchanged. You can see it literally unchanged for 11. I think when I looked the last day of 2011, the only increase was some dividends, but the index itself had not really changed. Looking at where our tax revenues come from, we still, for all of the diversification that we've been working on, our 5-borough economic diversification plan, and thank God we did that or we'd be in very big trouble, because you can see what's happened to member firms. This is a good proxy for the whole financial industry, what's happened to their earnings. In '08, they went way down, and here, they're certainly below. Everybody thought the recovery was back. It is not necessarily. and forecasts are for only modest growth. We had projected another $6.9 billion in earnings, and in fact, earnings were less than our projections. This is some information about just the tech campus. We hope to have other schools want to come here and other businesses want to locate here because of Cornell's drive and excitement and willing to make an investment along with the Technion for us. Long term, this is the kind of thing that we need more of. It will really drive our economy. Much of it after most of us have retired. Visitors tourism is still a real job creator for those starting up the economic ladder. A lot of the jobs don't pay well, but they are jobs. And the traditional ways in America was to come to America and you take a low-paying job, much less skills required than what you had in the old country, but it's what you can get, and then you build from there. And that's where the great fortunes have come from, and that's where people who then, maybe they didn't go to college, but their children did. It's the traditional American way. So it's really important to us to create jobs at this level, as well as jobs at the level that Cornell would create. Can we keep doing it? I don't know. A lot of pressure to keep doing it, but I think our NYC and Company really has shown that they just have some spectacular people. This is a battle all the time. Every other city in the world is trying to take tourists, and we have to compete with them every day. And we have some very good people who really have delivered the goods for us, as well as the fact that the city is safe and the city is exciting and the city is affordable, and people here are welcoming to immigrants and to visitors from all around the world. So we're all in this together, but that is really good news. The real estate industry, the good news is not as good. It is slightly improving. This is large office transactions, commercial real estate. People say, well, you know, you do have this problem of the financial industry contracting, and that's going to hurt the real estate market. And it does when you look here. But take a look. We're still 9.3% for all of New York, 10% for Midtown, downtown 9.9, Midtown South 6.1. Even where everybody said, like downtown, nobody's ever going to live there again. Remember, that was the zeitgeist back in right after the terrible tragedy of 9/11, and we said that's not true. We're going to make sure that that's a place that's welcoming and open. It's got great transportation and buildings and views and all of the things that you need to have a thriving economy. And in fact, that's what's happened. Downtown has been turned into a 24/7 community, and it's one of the hot neighborhoods in the city. And you compare New York to any place else. And just look at some of these cities. Detroit, their problems of the automobile industry moving out are well documented, but Phoenix and Dallas and Atlanta and Seattle, all these cities up here, and we are so far down, you know, less than half the vacancy rate. Activity is rebounding a little bit in leasing. The asking rents are expected to go up along with that. Housing prices have not dropped as precipitously here as they did in the United States, but they're clearly way off where they were. And if you own a home and have a mortgage, it's a real problem, particularly if you're now underwater. The whole housing market is forecast to remain stable, but not to jump up dramatically anytime soon. And you see that in building permits, which is the orange line. And in the housing unit census from the U.S. Census Bureau. Now, let's go and take a look at some of the actual numbers. This is the PEG that we put in, and you can see the percentages that each agency had to reduce their budget, both in the second half of 2012, it added up to 1.8%. Or in all of 2013, that's added up to 4%. You can look at the individual numbers. I think somebody asked me, how do you come up with these numbers? The answer is, to a great extent, some things we can't control, but to a great extent, this sets our priorities. Our number one priorities are taking care and making sure that this city remains safe, making sure that you can walk on the streets, making sure we're protected from terrorists, making sure that when you need an emergency vehicle, whether it's police, fire, ambulance, that they get there in record time. And I'm happy to say The city has never been safer. We have not had a terrorist attack here since 9/11. We've foiled a number of them, and we will continue to do that. And you can walk in any place in the city during the day and not have to look over your shoulder, and most places at night, and there's very few cities in the world where you could say that. The revenues, the one number that looks funny, 17% reduction in expenses. Part of that is, most of that really is not a reduction in expenses, but it is bringing in a lot of revenue. The finance department has hired some more auditors, and we think that will bring in a lot of revenue. So it's the way we count this, an agency can either reduce its expenses or increase the revenue. In this case, it's really all on the revenue side. And the other number that you should look out for that might stand out is this 6.5% for ACS and for social services. That really is not a cut. That is where the federal government or state government's replacing some services they're providing it. So we can cut the dollars, but we're not cutting the services. So those are the only, I think, misleading numbers when you look here. The gaps I talked about, this is what we're doing now that we just put in back in November. And here is those numbers for November. The November plan that was implemented, $465 million savings in 12 and $1 billion in 13. But go back and look at these old things. These were not one-time shots. These were not accounting gimmicks. These were real reductions in the number of people, in the cost of services, which means the number of people employed in the city, since the business model for a city really is you hire people to provide services, and so if you want to spend less, you just have to have fewer people. If you want to maintain the services, you have to have them more productive, and that's exactly what we've been able to do. It's pretty hard to argue that almost every service in the city isn't better than it was for each of the years going all the way back in 10 years. But the number of people that are providing those services, as I said before, have gone down just under 7%. So the first of the pegs we did before '08 are still giving us in 2013 a savings of $1 billion. The ones we did back in July to June of '09, saving us $2 billion. And so the $6-odd billion was the number I taught you before. If we had not done this, we'd have to come up with $6 billion more to provide the same services. A couple of things I wanted to point out. Education, in the end, it is still the future of our world, of our country, of our state, and of our city. And so we have doubled the spending on education since '02. Agencies, generally, salaries have gone up just about the rate of inflation, slightly less in many cases. In this case, it's gone up dramatically. Why? Because our teachers were way underpaid. We were losing them to other counties. We have to be able to attract the best and the brightest, and I think every study keeps showing again and again and again. Teacher quality is what matters. We have to get the best teachers from around the world to come here. That's the future of our children, and it's more important than any economic thing short term. We just have to reach in our pockets and make sure our kids have the future that we want for them, and they're the ones that are going to take care of the rest of us, remember. And you can see here where we basically split the cost of education with the state, and now where it is, roughly they take a third and we take 2/3 of the expense. And that's when you'll see, when we look at what's happened to the city budget, this is where we had to put $2 billion of city taxpayer funds in last year because the federal government cut us back $850 million in stimulus money we're using for education, as did the state. And just either you're going to lay off a whole bunch of teachers or we were going to go continue and reach into our pockets to do it, and we chose to reach into our pockets. Pensions, the other thing I talked about. Pension costs. This is what we had thought we were going to spend, and when you look in the book, you will see that the amount of money we're dedicating to pensions is less by about $600 million in 2012 and $600 million in 2013, and the question is why. The actuary who's not finalized what he wants to do, and remember, it has to be approved by the state legislature, but he said he wants to change the assumption on reinvestment rate from 8% to 7%, but he wants to move it in over a long period of time. So while we thought we were going to have to make up that difference much more this year, It turns out we do not. And in fact, it's perverse, but if the legislature were to not approve a reduction in the reinvestment rate, our pension contribution would be even lower. What that means is you're going to have a bigger gap down the road, and our kids are going to have to come up with more monies that we should, being fiscally prudent and responsible adults, we should be putting in today. So we had really wanted to put in more. The actuary says, no, I want you to put in this smaller amount. And if the legislature doesn't go along with what the actuary wants, it's going to be even less. And it's just, what we don't want to do is to have a pension system that is dangerously underfunded. Now, keep in mind, we have a defined benefit plan. So even if we don't fund the pension system is going to have to come up with the monies to provide retirees' benefits. And if we don't have the pension system funded, you're going to have to reach into the taxpayers' dollars down the road each year and do that. That would be calamitous given the size of the pension obligations. We're already paying out more in pension benefits and health benefits than we do in salaries. And it's just going to get worse. It's also interesting to note that when the stock market goes down and up, it really doesn't change the amount that we have to put in. And the reason for that is when there's a change in the assets, you recognize and can reduce your contribution, or recognize and have to increase your contribution over a 6-year period. And every year they start another 6-year period. The first year there's nothing, and then it slowly grows. So all of that gets sort of smoothed out. It would be better if their investments were a lot better and made a lot more money. But I think in the last 10 years, they've on average made 5.6% in a world where they were supposed to make 8%, according to an assumption built into law, which obviously doesn't make any sense. And taking it down to 7% is, I suppose, better than 8%. But even that is, I would argue, not all that realistic given what's happened in the real world. We all want to dream, and we all want to force numbers to come out correctly, but that's not the way the world works. So pensions are still a very big problem. The reinvestment is a very big problem. But we have funded this pension system to the extent that the actuary has asked us to fund it. And we were willing to do more, and in fact had planned to do more. So I suppose the good news is it's easier to balance the budget. The bad news is that is an obligation we have just transferred to our children. Here are the benefits for it's a percentage of salary and wages for all city employees and city funds. Here is for uniform workers, and here where I talked about for the first time in 2012, this fiscal year, the pensions and fringe benefits will be over 100% of what we pay out in salaries. There is nobody in the private sector that could come remotely close to that. No company could survive doing that. And we talk about what we have to do. The governor's plan, which we fully support, and we'll do anything to help him to come up with what he wants, a tier 6 for the state, a tier 5 for the city, where those who we have yet to hire would just be offered jobs with less benefits. You don't have to take the job. We don't have any obligation to somebody who's yet to take a job. We do have an obligation, I've always thought, to satisfy what we promised in the past to our current workers, and we will continue to do that. And some people say, oh, it's not fair to have workers working next to each other with different benefits. Keep in mind, the fact that the state is talking about tier 6 and we're talking about tier 5 means they have 5 different levels at the state, and we have 4 different levels already at the city. So that's a ridiculous argument. The bottom line is we just can't afford to keep doing this. And at some point, the taxpayer is going to stand up and say to their elected officials, I hope it's now, we're going to support the governor in this. The governor deserves support. Capital budget. Keep in mind we have a 5-year capital budget. Each year we update it. We've increased our capital budget this time by $700 million. There's just so many things where we can make investments, like the investment that we want to make for Cornell, or like more parks and bridges and things that we need in this city, and we're not going to walk away from that. And there are tables showing what the big projects are. Keep in mind that each year these go up and down. This is not a budget that we cut the capital budget. It was that in that particular year, some of the very big contracts didn't get signed, or the project didn't get started, or the design took less, and so it got moved into here, or more, and it got moved into here. And it always looks bigger for next year, but then the practical reality is a lot of the things in this budget get stretched out over time. So the bottom line is we are continuing to grow our capital budget, I think, responsibly, and the projects that we are doing, when you go down and read it, I think most of you will shake your head and say they're right, that these are things we should be doing if we're going to have a future in this city. Let me just try to outline some of the things in the tables. We've tried to reduce the number of tables that you get because I think it is very complex. Nobody really understands it. There was, if you remember, a budget modification in November. Today is another budget modification. At the end of these charts, I'll show you a chart that lets you go from one to another. But if you look, the changes are de minimis. So let's really just look and see what's going on with the benefit of looking in February of 2012. And what we think we're going to do is have tax revenues of $67,369,000,000 and expenses of $67,369. Why is it exactly even? Because we've used in this stabilization, we brought $3.7 billion in of our reserve from last year, and we've used up all but 1.2 of it, and that 1.2 of it we've moved into 2013. But look, nothing in 2013, 14, and 15, 16, whatever, 14, 15, 16. There is no more reserve. We finally used up all of the reserve. Thank goodness we had the reserve. It's a shame we didn't have more, but that was what we could manage to put away. So if you just go and look, you'll see that, yes, there's a zero gap, because the only ways we got there, though, was to bring in money from 2011. And yes, there's a zero gap in 2013, only because we were able to bring in money from 2012. But we still have $3 billion, $3.5, and $3.4 billion gaps in the fiscal years 2014, 15, and 16. This shows you what changes in what the distribution of our tax revenues. People always ask where it's coming from. Property tax is very stable because it's so far ahead. It's been gated by these laws that you can only increase tax, somebody's individual tax bill by a certain amount, not as fast as the appreciation in their houses. And while lots of them are still up, there's still plenty ahead of where they were before. Economically sensitive taxes tend to be much more volatile, and much less confidence you should have in the forecast. These are pretty locked in. These really are estimates, conservative estimates, I think, of what we will get down the road. And then there's some non-tax revenue of a variety of different things, which tends to be relatively small compared to these two things. So year to year, the amount of monies that we have to spend, total revenue is up 4.5% from the year before. We forecast 5.8% for going up again, but then dropping to almost zero in 1 year. And we'll go back to where that comes from. Here is similar ways to look at it. The controllable agency expenses, the non-controllable, and so let's just look at those. The controllable, year to year, you can see the change. You can see the amount. It's maybe even more illustrative at the end of these presentations, where we show you where those funds come and where they go. And you'll see how much of it goes to personnel costs versus other things. Here, if you take a look, in the bottom, this box shows education broken out. Keep in mind, the city part of this is duplicated up here. So here's the Department of Education without federal and state funds. Here it is with federal and state funds. And here you can see the mayor's office and other electeds going forward, each of these agencies. Non-controllable pensions still, it is projected to flatten out here, but that's really because nobody projects us to have a bigger labor force. And we don't know what's going to happen with North. If he were to reduce faster, then that would not be true. We would have to put more money in And then you can see some of these other things that where the federal government has provided money, but then there's no more money going out. Debt service is still, the debt keeps growing. We need to build the things that are going to give us a future, even if we can do it at lower interest rates. This is for 2012. We're halfway through this year already, but you can see where pensions and fringe benefits and salaries are. You can see how much in city funds and all funds. Let's look at probably more interesting, looking at fiscal 2013. You have exactly similar kinds of things, but you can take a look and see, for example, the police department, yes, they spend $4.2 billion in salaries and wages, but they spent $8.7 billion in total costs. If you go down to Department of Education, they spend 9.4, but 15.7 when you count in all of the benefits. And over here you can see how much is paid for by the state and federal governments versus the city. So I think those are useful things for you to look at afterwards. This is just the change between 1 and 2, between 2012 and 2013. And as you can see, they're all pretty small numbers. This is changes since the plan back then in the city dollars. Here is maybe another ways of looking at it, which you might find interesting between the two plans for 2013. And you can see the percentage change from one year to another, but you can also see the percentage change from one to another from the two estimates. And you look here, the estimates changes are, you know, 0.6, 0.5, 1.6, 2.6, 0.996. So there's not much has changed between the estimate in November of 2011, which was 3 months ago, and right now. That's it. We'll be happy to take some questions. I think if you want to summarize it, increased capital budget, no layoffs of teachers or uniform service people, smaller workforce, still making the investments we have to make, acted prudently, but we've now used up our reserve, and we'll have to find ways to help